Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Korsmo, the curator at the Tacoma Historical Society. I'm really happy you could join us tonight for a special program to go along with our exhibit, Bank on Tacoma. We're going to be looking at a couple special items out of the collection that didn't quite fit with the rest of the theme, but that I think are nonetheless really interesting, and I hope you'll enjoy taking a look at. These are some of the childhood clothing items that belonged to prominent Tacoma bankers J.C. Weathered and Reno Odlin. And so I hope you like what we've been able to put together for you here tonight. Let's just switch over to look at the pretty items and not at me. So the first piece we're going to look at today is associated with John Coleman Weathered. John Weathered was born in Kentucky in 1846 and arrived permanently in Tacoma in 1883. He was really involved in real estate. He was also a founding member of the National Bank of Commerce, which he was vice president of from 1887 to 1892. More interestingly for us at the Historical Society, or I should say most interestingly, he was also an avid writer, keeping daily diaries, which we have several volumes from the 1870s through 1890s, to give us a rare sort of firsthand account of what Tacoma was like in those early years of the city. And so the item we're sharing with you tonight is this cap, which was said to belong to him as a baby. It comes to us from descendants of his wife's sister, Annie Wade Farnham. So this is a donation by Frank and Mary Taylor. I believe they're, or at least he is a great grandson of Annie. And so a great grandnephew of JC and Dilla. So the cap came with a note stating that it had been made by John's mother, who died shortly after he was born on February 26, 1846. And so I've obviously wanted to look a little more into Frances Simmons Weathered, about her life and what she was like. And unfortunately, she is a bit of an enigma, mainly because she died so young. An important source when we're looking at people from the 19th century in particular are the federal censuses. But if you're looking before about 1850, you have something like this. The only names present are those of the head of household, and everyone else is a number or a tally mark in a category of age, gender, and free condition. So the information that we have about, for instance, Frances's siblings, a lot of that comes from 1880, 1860 censuses where they're actually writing down things like a person's full name and their age and how long they've been married, and occasionally useful things like occupation and how many children they have and where they were born and where their parents were born. And we don't have any of that for Frances. What we have, after a rather circuitous little hunt to track down the rest of her family and compare the children's known ages with the boxes, are two tally marks showing that a girl who was not otherwise accounted for later was born to Charles and Elizabeth Simmons between 1825 and 1830. In fact, the only document I can find from her lifetime, which actually includes her name on it, is her father's will from 1844. So we know that Frances had married John's father, Wilson, by September of 1844, and that she died in 1846, which is also then attested to on her headstone, which only has her name and the year 1846 on it. So comparing that with the family census, we know that she was no older than about 21 when she died. Probably, my personal suspicion is that she was probably 20, because she not only had a brother also born in 1825, which means unless they were twins or had some sort of January to December birthday math happening, she's unlikely to have been born before 1826. Now I look at the rest of her family who we have the more information for. We see her sister marrying at 18, two of her sisters-in-law marrying at 19. And since we know she was definitely married by 1844, that's highly suggestive of a 1826 birthday, 1844 marriage, and then her death in 1846. And so in many ways, all we really have to go on for Frances is a little bit of speculation. And of course, this one relic. Gets a little easier, if we go just a few years later, 1850, you start seeing names for people other than the head of household, which is how we know, for instance, that young John, age 4, was actually living with his paternal grandparents, the Weathereds, and probably being cared for by his Aunt Patience, who then shows up on subsequent censuses. She actually ended up in Tacoma with him and died here in 1893. So Frances had lived just a few more years, we'd probably have much better information on her than we do. Going back to what we do have, notably this cap has some very interesting attributes. I find it fascinating. So the cap itself is quite small. As the note suggested, it was probably made for newborn size. Comparing it to some patterns, I was able to find that were contemporary, and it's pretty standard. If you measure on the brim here, you have about 14.5 inches. A first infant size pattern that I found in the Workwoman's Guide, first published 1838, it suggests having a slightly fuller cap of about 18 inches around, but otherwise very similar. The cap itself has only 2 pieces. So it has this brim, which is all in one piece, and then it's very slightly gathered onto a little crown around the back. And the crown is sort of horseshoe shaped, has a flat bottom, tall sides, and then rounded top. And all of the rest of the shaping for this cap comes from that casing that you see. I'm not sure if the cursor is actually going to show up for you, but there's a little casing here right around the back, from the area that'd be sitting right at the back of the neck, that has little strings drawn through it. And that's really what's providing a lot of your shaping here for the cap. So here's a plate from the Workwoman's Guide showing different infant cap styles and how that fullness is handled around the back. And the one that's most similar, of course, to the Weatherhead cap is this horseshoe shaped one up here, where it has back piece and then the slightly full brim attached. Looking closer at the cap, you can see that this one is made out of a machine bobinette. Bobinette was so-called as a net made with bobbins. So it's a form of lace that was mechanized as early as 1809. Contemporary sources from the 1840s talk about the lace industry just exploding through the 1820s and 30s as different refinements are made on these these net making machines, to the point where you can have a variety of widths, from little trimmings that are about 1/4 of an inch wide all the way up to multiple yard wide pieces useful for garments and cutting out. The machine net could be purchased plain, or it could be decorated either by hand in a finishing process, which was a huge industry at the period, or it could also be spotted and embellished on the machines. There's some dispute about exactly how high of quality that was in the 1840s. There's several interesting law cases that come up about patent rights for different machines and how early the machine spotted nets were being sold versus the plain nets, which were initially more economical. I just looked better having them decorated by hand afterwards. But this cap was definitely decorated by hand on that machine-made net. Each of the pieces, I'm going to sort of flip back and forth between a few of these detail shots, was individually hemmed around the edges, and then they were joined together back here with a whip stitch. You can just barely see where one of the threads is loosening on that back seam, that whip stitch. The stitching on this is all done in a very, very, or I should say the functional stitching on this cap is all done in a very fine thread, so much that I was having a lot of trouble getting the camera to focus on it. It's actually pretty hard to see. But the hemming on the brim and on the back piece of the cap are both done just in a running stitch in a very fine thread. That same fine thread is used to whip on the 2 pieces, joining them to each other. And then a much heavier, coarser thread is used on the embroidery to make it stand out. It's worked in a double thread, which is precisely what the contemporary instructions call for. I was looking particularly at some magazines from 1844 to 1850, And they definitely talk about the bobinette embroidery as being the most common form of lace made in the home, though bobbin lace is of course still possible. It's just not as popular and very time consuming. And see if I can find that quote. Well, to paraphrase it at least, I don't want to waste anyone's time here. For the most part, this is being worked, this style of thread is worked either in darning or in running stitches using, let's say, a double length of quartz threads. You get that design really showing through, which is precisely what happened here. You're seeing sort of two different motifs. Go back a little further here. I should say 3 different motifs. So we've got this floral motif, which shows up in 4 places on the cap, once on the very back of the crown, which is quite hard to see, and then 3 places on the brim, the top and on either side. And so that is primarily worked in that long running stitch. It's being used in different densities to make the infill lines here versus the little sort of fringy effect here where everything's being worked side by side. The one place we see a stitch that isn't a running stitch in this embroidery is in this floral motif where there's actually a chain stitch, making the much heavier stems on the floral motif. We are also seeing a second motif is this geometric stripe that appears in 2 places on either side of the brim, sort of dividing the 3 different floral motifs. These are all strictly done in running stitch. And if you look very closely at it, you can see that the stitch is going over 3 meshes and then ducking under either a single thread or single mesh, is to say a single hole in that bobinette formation. And so you're getting a very long, clean line. It's not technically very difficult, but it's very precisely executed and quite effective. And then the third design element we're seeing are these little 6-pointed stars, which is just that same stitch. They're going over about 4 meshes and just outside to center, outside to center, outside to center, making a line with a little X over it, a little sort of star or flower shape. I find particularly interesting is looking at how these were worked, you can figure out a little bit about the order the cap was assembled in. Particularly when you're looking here at the brims and the hem areas, you don't have any motifs that are actually cut off by the edge of the material, except arguably a little bit of this geometric portion, which is a strong argument in favor of this having been embroidered for the piece rather than having been purchased as a piece of embroidered net. But when you look really closely at the hem, you can see that even where you have, for instance, these stars going onto the hem, onto that boundary, if you look on the underside, it's not going all the way through. So that was worked over the single layer of net, which was then the blank portion was folded up underneath and hemmed, as opposed to being worked after it was already hemmed, in which case that motif would be going through all 3 layers. The exception, as I mentioned, is that geometric piece, which seems to have been run closer to the actual edge of the material. And so when you look there, again, the stitches themselves aren't going through all the layers, but the layer that's folded over does have some of its own design continuing, which is giving a sort of interesting little artifact right there. There's also, as you can sort of see, this heaviness right on the fold. That is an extra length of that thread. It's not embroidered through there, it's just sort of set into the turn itself, giving a little extra visual weight and a tiny bit of actual weight to the cap itself, just sort of finishing that edge a little bit more. The cords on this are very fine. This is like kitchen string level of fine. We've got a little tie at the corners of each brim, and then a little tiny bow here run through the back casing. So by looking at the order there, or rather by looking at the assembly, and here you can see again, looking into the inside of the cap, you've got your very fine hem stitch, and then you've got that encased little bit of thicker thread. And here we've got the chain stitch being worked right onto the material, forming that back hem, but not actually going through all the layers. So my suspicion is that when this was worked, that the boundary of the piece, if not the design itself, was marked out on the netting somehow. The embroidery was worked and then it was cut out, and then each individual piece hemmed, the two pieces whipped together, and then this back neck edge area was hemmed and had this little drawstring run through. And so you're probably wondering to yourself, why would anyone go to all this trouble to, like, what is this cap supposed to do? The short answer is it's supposed to look pretty. There's a certain practicality towards infant caps in this period. A lot of the sizes that are given are really meant for young children. So newborns, children in their first year of life. So there's a sort of a working hypothesis that at least initially these were meant to provide a little bit of extra warmth and protection before the baby actually has hair, also to look pretty. But you have some like this net cap. Here's an example I've pulled out here from the Ladies' Companion in 1850 of a design for a point lace cap. So not all of these are practical. Not all of these are flannel caps for warming baby's head after just been bathing the baby. Some of them are just meant to look pretty. So then moving on, jumping forward about 60 years, the other piece we're going to be looking at today is associated with Tacoma banker Reno Odlin, who was born up in Ship Harbor, Anacortes area of Skagit County in 1897. He didn't get to Tacoma until 1936, though his father had previously been associated with the area. And he was the leader of Puget Sound National Bank from 1936 to 1972 and died in 1979. And so the item we have attributed to Reno Odlin is this adorable child's dress from the first decade of the 20th century. It comes to us from Eileen Morganson, or given in her honor. Eileen was the mother of Patricia Mogensen, who was married to Reno Odlin Jr. So we're looking at a one generation difference here instead of a 3 generation difference when the garment came to us. At first glance, this let's say the provenance here makes perfect sense for the garment. This is definitely beginning of the 20th century. You've got that elongated bodice with the short skirt, great popularity of lawn dresses in the period. It's also entirely machine sewn, except for 2 little places I'll be showing you in a moment. So just for some comparison here, we've got example of children's dresses from Good Housekeeping magazine in 1902. And again, just like on the Audlen dress, you're seeing really long bodices, relatively short skirts in comparison, dresses being worn by both boys and girls, and a particular emphasis on the shoulder area, with these sort of faux yoke and long collar and yoke effects. Now this is Delineator in 1907. Again, we're seeing both girls and boys dresses. Waistlines are not on the natural waist. They're either non-existent or fairly long. So getting back to the Audlen dress, just interesting stuff we noticed about it. It's made out of a fairly lightweight cotton, probably a bit finer than a modern muslin, but very much in line with the lawn, dimity, fine muslins in use in the early 19th century. The piece itself was 36 inches wide material. We know that because one of the skirt pieces is actually selvaged. You can measure the whole piece. There's 2 different embellishments that are used in addition to the cotton itself. There is a machine embroidered white work insertion that you see here at the waistband, as well as forming the upper portion of the yoke and the little sleeve cuffs. And then there is a scalloped edge trim, the similar design, making the bottom of the skirt hem there, the bottom edges of the cuff ruffle and the faux yoke, and then also gathered to make the little neck ruffle up there. The dress itself is 18 inches along the center front from the base of the throat to the waistline, which is not the waistline. And then the skirt's only about 10 inches. So you've got that proportion there that's very early 20th century. Waistband is probably hitting around the hip. The skirt, when worn, is probably right around the knees. Descriptions I can find for this period are recommending that for children up to about age 6, so past toddler up to about age 6, you're aiming for a knee-length skirt, and your knee just barely peeking along the bottom. And then older children, sort of the 6 through 10, 12 range, it's just past the knee. The sleeves are 10 inches long. They're going to be about a 3/4 length sleeve, 10-inch bicep space there. The chest area is 30 inches right under the armpits there. It gradually widens out, so you're getting about 32 at that waist. That's really the hip. So a little bit of shaping on the bodice, but it's very minimal, and it's all exclusively in the side seams. There's no darts or gathering to fit elsewhere. It just very gradually widens out towards the waist. And then we've got that sort of faux yoke effect going on up top with the trim. So the main decorative element you're probably noticing is the difference between the horizontal and the vertical tucks. These are all 1/4-inch tucks. They're very closely spaced. They're hitting 5 of them in about 1.5 inches area, and then about 1.25 inches in between sets. There's 4 in the front and 4 in the back. This is detail at the inside of the skirt, showing those selvages that I talked about, that measuring to get the size of the skirt. There's 2 panels in the skirt. There's the full 36-inch width, and then there's a narrower 29-inch width. There's no further treatment on the inside of the seams. They're just stitched together and pressed down to one side. Even on the side where there is a raw edge instead of a selvage, just press down so the selvage is on top, and there it is. Another reason for using this particular image is if you look over here, you can see one of the very few places there's any hand sewing, that while the skirt panels have been seamed together, the edging here has actually had a little bit of a hand running stitch done to finish off the circle. You can also see from these are being handled here, and I'm looking on the back side of these tucks, that it looks like the panel, at least this seam, was made before the tucks were put in rather than afterwards. So you have some interesting options here. This is another view on that inside, looking closer at the trim, which is one of the first clues to me that this was a machine trim. In addition to the way it's deployed, you do things generally a little bit differently if you're working a piece to fit a specific garment rather than buying it in yardage and cutting it down. But you'll notice that every single one of these transitions in the motif is happening at the exact same place. Just with a regularity that's very unlikely to appear in handwork, especially when you're considering that hand embroidery, you're really working with pieces that are a yard maximum and often a lot shorter. So you're going to have thread is ending a lot more. You aren't going to have this just continuous throughput of thread. Nonetheless, very pretty. Also very popular for the period. As I was looking up children's dress in this era, I was finding lots of references to Swiss embroideries, to machine-made whitework, even an entire article about the great different ways you can use these ready-made embroideries to make and embellish children's clothing of various sorts. So spot on for about 1905, 1907. You can also see, looking here, how the embroidery was used to finish the edge of the skirt. That this is the top edge of the embroidery has been folded down, as has the bottom raw edge of the skirt, and then they've just been stitched one over the other, so the raw edges of both are encased there in the hem, giving this lovely scalloped embroidery as your actual hem to the dress. There's a little close-up here on the sleeve, so you can see the edge of that faux yoke over the bodice, and then the repeated motifs with the gathered trimming making the little ruffled cuff, and then the insertion above that sort of terminating the sleeve proper. Sleeves are fairly narrow and put on fairly straight. If you look over here, you see there's almost no fullness over the shoulder, and a very little bit on the underside of the arm. The sleeve itself is cut in two pieces, so there's a seam right here down the middle of the front and another one on the back. It's sort of hard at this size and the delicacy of the fabric to get a sense of the shaping, but the sleeves definitely want to be turning and curving in a bit towards the front, which is another good indication that this dress fastens down the back and not down the front. Is that if you tried to put it on so that the buttons went down the front, the poor kid would have their arms sort of dragging back behind them, and that would not be good. So front buttoning dress, back buttoning dress, buttons down the back, and the sleeves then curve naturally to the front the way a person's arms move. Another close-up there on the cuffs. You can see the two different decorative trims in use there. You've got these insertion band here, and then you've got the scalloped edging here. Both of them are all white threads, primarily worked in satin stitch with those beautiful eyelets and some little decorative wheels in the case of the insertion. This is a view onto the inside of the bodice, sort of confirming that yes, that is a faux yoke. It's not just very carefully repeated tucks lining up between a yoke and a lower bodice. It's all one piece within the trim applied in that square shape, which is popular neckline shape, a popular yoke shape, and just a very sort of pretty effect. You can also see here a little bit, and we'll get to this more later, but the seamstress or the maker very cleverly used the selvages towards the open side here in the back so that there's no additional seam finish needed. They just reached the edge and folded it over, made an inch wide placket for buttoning. This is a look also on the inside, but down at how the skirt has been attached to the bodice. And so this top bit here, this is the bodice. And that is just the raw edge of the bodice extending about an inch below the waistline. So the skirt itself was gathered up by machine. It was stitched down just directly on top of this bodice, and then that insertion waistband was put on the top to cover the raw seam of the skirt, leaving only the raw seam of the bodice on the inside here. And here's that view from the outside. You can see the skirt, you can see the insertion band, and you can actually see through those eyelet holes to the tuck beneath it. You also, if you look very closely here, you can see little places where the skirt edge isn't quite covered up by the insertion. And so you can catch a little bit of that machine stitch thing for the gathers. So then here's the full view down the back. You can see this has 10 shell buttons, or mother of pearl specifically. They're 3/8 of an inch wide each, spaced about 2 inches apart, going all the way from that waist to neck area. And you've got that repeat of your tuck sets. And then here's a nice close-up on those lovely buttonholes, 5/8 of an inch, just beautifully done, hand sewn with a little pearl edging there. Oh, they're just gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous work. Aspire to someday make buttonholes as neat and clean as those. And then you can also see here just how fine the machine sewing itself is. That I was counting between 18 and 20 stitches to the inch. It's very hard to focus on things that small. And it's just very, I like this dress a lot. There's a lot going for it. So sort of to revisit that question, so as I alluded to, boys absolutely wore dresses throughout the 19th century, at least to a certain age. So here we actually have J.C. Weathered's little nephew in the early 1890s. So about 10-ish years before the Audlen dress. So you can see his style's a little bit different this period. Bodices are not quite so long in comparison to skirts. I thought he's a cheerful little fellow down in Hillsboro, Oregon. This baby, however, is actually from Tacoma. We don't know who it is, but the photograph was taken by Hattie Campbell, so probably 1890s in Tacoma. And as I mentioned, dresses are worn by both boys and girls, so don't have very much to go on for guessing who this baby is and what their story is. But I love that dress. Love, love, love it. But getting back to some examples from the 1900s, and this is from the Ladies' Home Journal 1907 advertisement showing girls and boys dresses with, again, those really long bodices. Here we've got that trim making the faux yoke effect on this schoolgirl. Here's the actual lower neckline on this one. But I do think it's worth mentioning or worth alluding to is that you can see that the boys' style dresses are a little bit different from girls, at least once they get sort of to the age where they're referring to boys and girls' dresses rather than children's dresses. So looking at the patterns being advertised in a lot of these magazines, really noticing that a child's dress, unisex term, is almost exclusively for very young infants and toddlers. Once you're getting past about the age of 3 or so, they do start differentiating between girls and boys. And more particularly that boys' dresses really stop somewhere between the ages of 4 and 6, which is to say that when a pattern is being advertised for a boy's dress, they'll mention that it fits ages this to that. So using an age as a stand-in for pattern size for at least determining which pattern you should be ordering. And the latest one I found so far was a boy's dress pattern that went through age 6. Most of them are 2 to 4. Boys' suits patterns are frequently 6 to 12, 5 to 10. And so you've got a bit of overlap there between ages 4, 5, and 6. But the thing with the Audlen dress is that the best standards I could find to compare it to suggest that it probably is fitting a child closer to 8 or even 10 years old, which would be a bit of an outlier for boys' dress in this period. Other respect in which it would be an outlier is the material. That find lots of references to lawn dresses for girls, to these delicate white dresses with the embroidery and the insertion lace. So these are examples from 1902 with the entire article, and then particularly included this Woman's Home Companion advertisement from 1908. It's part of a larger advertisement which does specify that it's for girls' lawn dresses in a variety of sizes. What I found interesting is how similar this dress is to the Audlen dress. It has the row of tucks running horizontally on the skirt. It has the sets of tucks running vertically on the bodice. This option does have a long sleeve rather than 3/4 sleeve, and it has this insertion or embroidery panel down the front instead of the square bodice, the square faux yoke trim, but it's otherwise very similar, which I found very interesting, sort of suggestive that the date for this dress is closer to maybe 1907, 1908, which would put it a little bit late for Reno to still be wearing dresses since he was born in summer of 1897. So this is a 1908 dress. He'd be 11 years old, which is definitely on the far side for boys' dresses, not to mention these lawn dresses seem to be more of a specific style for girls. But this does raise a very intriguing possibility because Reno's first wife, Edith Murphy, was born in 1898. And so if this dress was actually her dress, that was just accidentally attributed to her husband rather than her later, that would actually fit very well for the style of dress and for her age. Even better, for my personal opinion, if it is actually hers, is that she was in Tacoma in 1907 and Reno was not. He was still up in Skagit County. But the Anna Murphy, widow with 3 children, arrived in Tacoma between late 1906 and early 1907. So they first appear in the 1907 directory. And we know that Edith actually graduated from high school in Tacoma around 1916. Fortunately, that is one of the years that we don't yet have a copy of the commencement edition of the Tacoma. Otherwise, I would be showing you her graduation photo. There's a sort of a third possibility. It could be that the dress is not Edith or Reno's and is actually belonged to Beatrice, who is Reno's second wife, who he married after Edith died in the 1960s. And she was a few years younger, born around 1902. So not completely outside of the window for having worn a dress like this in her youth, but with the size and what I'm seeing about magazine patterns with this particular style, think Edith is a slightly more likely candidate than Beatrice. So I hope you enjoyed this little dive into two of our collection items. And I also hope that at some point in the near future, we'll be able to have these sorts of presentations again in person so we can all ooh and ah over the artifacts sort of in the same place. But meanwhile, thank you so much for continuing to support our museum and for joining us online here tonight. And I hope you all have excellent, excellent evenings. Take care.